Good afternoon. Let's begin. So we are at the last lecture of the semester. So a few reminders for the students. First of all, please check your grades. They're posted on Canvas. Make sure we haven't made a mistake. If you see something, email me, and that's peter.hess@Cornell. There's another peter.hess that will get your emailer. He received one. If you email me, I'll give you a response. Okay. There's one additional assignment, the summary of today's seminar. And please hand in any additional assignments. If you skipped an assignment, or even if you didn't come to the seminar, you can look at the Canvas. If you hand in any missing assignments, you'll get at least hand those on with next week. Particularly, I'm interested in suggestions for the seminar series and also speakers that you'd like to, and if you have someone that you think would be good to come next year, let me know. Also, so the seminar series is always open. It's open to the public. So I invite you also to come in following years, if you see, particularly if you see a seminar that you would like to listen to. You're always welcome. So today is my great pleasure to have here Sonali McDermid, and he's an associate professor in Department of Environmental Studies at NYU. And we had in fact had planned to bring Sonali to Cornell 3 years ago. And the pandemic got in the way. So finally, we brought her here, which is great. So Sonali graduated in 2006 and got PhD in Columbia with a specialization in climate change. Her research focuses in variability, use agriculture with an eye to identifying and quantifying important feedbacks on uncertainties. To this end, she uses a variety of tools and data sets, including global climate and Earth system models, process-based crop models, and observed data sets. The research includes an understanding of both climate and agriculture and food security and the impacts of agriculture on the environment. And the work strives to identify and contextualize the role of environmental preservation in food and nutritional security, particularly in Southeast Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. What constitutes responsible, sustainable agriculture? How might we lessen our impact while feeding everyone? She's a co-lead for Agriculture Intercomparison Improvement Project. She's recent Andrew Carnegie Fellow, Fulbright Kalam Fellow awardee. And she is now editor-in-chief of the AMS journal, American Meteorological Society journal, Earth Interactions. And I just saw more. She's also involved in climate and the arts, including eco-theater, storytelling, and performance. So, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Peter. Enter that today. Everything is performance. Speaking of performances, awesome. Yeah, sure. I see it. Yeah, way to go. That's awesome. I'm so pleased to be here today and to be your last lecture. I was kind of itching for the end of the semester. So thank you for showing up and for hearing me for a little bit. Hopefully I can partake in the festivities today. So I want to talk a little bit about food security and climate change today, and kind of the stuff that keeps me up at night. And so eating our cake without losing it, I'll explain exactly what I mean by that in just a second. But I'm going to do this through the lens of environmental modeling. And so I could, in the process of doing that, I'm going to give sort of an overview of this field and this area of work. But I'm highlighting the modeling component because I think there is so much room for development of these tools, both the tools themselves and grounding them, so to speak, in data and observations, that for those of you interested in kind of going into this field or interested in an earth science or systems perspective, I really encourage you to kind of examine and explore this area of sort of to engender some enthusiasm for getting into this space. And of course, a bit of a sobering start, but with the realities of climate change, particularly climate extremes, our food systems, our agricultural production systems are increasingly under pressure. What you're looking at here was the flooding that happened late last summer along the Indus River basin across and so we kind of had cumulatively throughout June, July, early August. What you're looking at here is snaking through this is the Indus River into the Sindh province, which is kind of further down around Pakistan. And so here, you know, that blue, that false color, it's already a little bit swollen, and less than a month later, we're seeing widespread catastrophic flooding, right? Huge crop losses, impacts, cotton and so on towards the southern alluvial plains. So these are things that we have to keep in mind, and these kinds of extremes are a little bit of a point of a really needed point of development that I'll touch upon in a second. Within these, we don't have really good models to be exploring these kinds of things from an agricultural perspective. So I want to start this a little bit provocatively in the sense that I want to look at modeling through the lens of security. We model Earth systems for a variety of reasons: to predict future climate change, to look at scenarios for high mitigation, high impact, and then we model do a lot of modeling around crop production, trying to understand the climate impacts on crop production, trying to understand potentials for crop production. And while that's really important and good, right, most of the modeling work that we do focuses on the big four: maize, rice, wheat, and soy across the world. And while these crops are super important and some of them serving food security, that's not actually getting at some of the underlying tensions and problems and questions that we have about food security. And despite the copious amounts of agricultural production that we have today, despite the premise that agricultural development over the 20th century was to serve food security or poverty alleviation, what you're looking at here is the Global Hunger Index of 2021, not too much different in 2022. But we are not feeding the world, right? So our current production systems, as they stand right now, are not feeding the world, right? And that's due to a variety of reasons. But it's a premise that we kind of have to start from and then start to ask, well, what are the normative entry points for modeling, right? And so, you know, when you look up the definition of food security, which I'm sure some of you have seen, right, we define it as such: the physical availability of food. Are you producing enough? Economic and physical access to food. Can you actually make your way, for example, to a market? Do you have money to pay for that food? And food utilization. Do you have clean water? Do you have access to energy? Can you prepare that food in a way that you can derive the full complement of nutrients from that? And that there needs to be some kind of sustainability and stability of these systems, which again, COVID really tested those assumptions of our global food system. And of course, there's intersection across a range of sustainable development goals, and often the way that we measure each of these can result in inadequate representation across all of them, and there are trade-offs to be had that we need to consider. And so these are also things that are right for the modeling space. But right now, much of modeling and much of what we do with respect to models focuses on the physical availability. Are we growing enough? And I want to just say right here, while this is going to be the rest of my talk and the focus of the talk, I am by no means naive. These, I would argue, are even more important in today's day and time as we have enough production, right? So where else are the shortfalls? So I won't get into that today, but happy to talk about it a bit later. Okay, And just to sort of reiterate this point, because I think it's maps, right? Sort of the spatially explicit representations of how, what, when, where we're growing are really nice entry points for the modeling space, right? Once we've got that information resolved across space and hopefully across time, we can start to ask questions. And I really like set of maps. So these are two different papers that you're looking at. On the left is one that's yield gap analysis. Interpret this. If you're green, okay, you're probably producing close to what your potential is, based upon climate conditions, maybe based upon water limitations as well too. If you're across these locations, you're not. You could potentially, based upon co-located climate conditions, maximal farmer yield are co-located, for example. And so this kind of yield gap analysis has been used in many ways, in part to direct where we need additional resources in order to get productivity. Fine. On the right-hand side is a paper I really love, in part because it just gets the juices going of what else we could be doing differently. What you're seeing are calories directly delivered to people, okay? So calories directly consumed by people. It's by Emily Cassidy in 2013. And the interesting thing about it is that it sort of has this mirror image look to it, right? Suddenly, we've flipped the narrative. And that's not to say that there's enough food being produced, but those are calories that are directly serving security. Areas of, and that's about a third of global crop calories that are being produced. In the oranges and reds, what we're seeing are calories that are produced but going to other end uses. Biofuels, maybe, animal agriculture, right? Secondary resources. So there's this flipping, right? And so when you start to look at global food security or yield, right? We can model yields, we can, but you start to look at through this lens, you start to interrogate, right? You start to really think about, well, if I'm sitting here modeling under climate change, right? What is that serving, right? I'm not saying it's not important. I'm just saying, what is it serving, right? And I would argue that food security should at least be one of those goals. Okay. Showed this in a little talk I did earlier, and this is sort of the structure of my own research. I'm interested culture on food security, and so I'll talk a little bit about the model for that as we move on. Get you thinking about if you are interested in any kind of or research in this space. Here are some entry points. A little bit about the side of the coin, which are agricultural impacts on the environment and the range of potential impacts. We'll end on is climate smart or agriculture that meets food while limiting our, right? That's what we're together. And for those social scientists in the room, I apologize. I can only do so much and still sleep at night. So I've got this like umbrella of socioeconomic and political system to neglect and or diminish the importance of these things. In fact, they really shape everything. And what happens across these two spaces will feed back and interact with the policy space, the governance space, the norms and decision making. And so that's something I'm cognizant of, and we just still have so far to go to be able to represent that in our models. And one theme that again and again and again in this space is irreducibility. What are things we just can't hope to represent decision making and how we decide to manage our okay, so models, which I'll talk about in just a second, just to kind of give us a common ground. And here I'm specifically referring to land and climate, but for those ocean-focused people in the room, yes, that's a whole other component that's really also critical to this picture. But models of Earth systems are important to assess the impacts of climate change and of alternative land management, right? But again, in the service of what? They can help us evaluate potentials and scenarios of change. And so models are very useful to this end, and I'll talk about that in a second. Modeling efforts should increasingly consider trade-offs and co-benefits of land use, land cover change, and agriculture through a food security lens, which is what I'm hoping for you to take away from this portion of the talk. And what I'll sort of end on in talking about that intersection are some key sources of uncertainty that limit our understanding of these interactions to date. And so these are things to hammer away at, right, in your own careers. Okay, so very quickly, and I'm only talking about one modeling component here, and I just threw this in right now. If you heard of a climate model or seen one, or read about them or had exposure to them? Okay, all right, more of you then. So when you start to look at future climate projections, worst case scenario, best case scenario, for example, right? What's used as an underlying premise for these IPC, these Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change assessment reports. In order to project those future impacts, we use models, right? There's no data. So what we employ are versions of what you're looking at here, right? We divide the globe up to a grid. Each model has its own resolution. Right now, probably state of the art is 100 kilometers by 100 kilometers in that horizontal grid box. The model also has layers deep into the ocean and layers vertically up into the top of the atmosphere. And within these grid cells and across these grid cells, we are keeping track of key processes, right? The way water moves, right? Throughout the planet, the way energy is transferred, motions of wind, of ocean currents, for example, changes in carbon, right? And biogeochemical cycling. There are many processes that are now represented in these Earth system models, which is kind of what you're seeing here in canonical diagram. Among them are now increasingly human systems, representations of agriculture. And some of these models now can even represent crop yields. So production, we're getting that fine-grained. You'll also see, some of these models are actually now trying urban areas as well, too, for those of you interested in urban modeling and impacts on climate. So these are becoming increasingly sophisticated, even if they are computationally quite intensive. What I'm not going to show here, but what I also want to highlight, because we'll show some results, is that we also have models of that are just looking at agriculture and just looking at crop yields. So models that don't include an atmosphere, right, or don't include an ocean, but are just of the land surface, or maybe just of a particular crop type. And so all of these models, right, we can sort of use them, couple them, and or integrate them in ways that allow us to project the impacts of climate change. Now, one thing that keeps me up at night is that all models are wrong. Some are really, really wrong, right? Some others, as you've heard, are useful. And so what level of information is required in order to make models useful, right? How much management information do you need? How much do you represent farmer decision-making, right? Where does that information come from, right? These are things that we're increasingly beginning to confront in this modeling space. And frankly, we don't have very good ways of doing it. But that leads to a set of other explorations, which I'll talk about in a bit. Questions on this? Maybe. I see you. What's that? Last later. Okay, good. Just to get us on the same page of what models we're talking about. I should also mention, there's a whole range of models. What you're looking at here, we call a process-based model. We're trying to represent physical processes and sort of your fundamental equations. So think back to your physics class, conservation of mass, conservation of momentum, first law of thermodynamics, right? That's what we're trying to represent here. But there are also statistical and empirical models that we can sort of bring into the mix, increasingly machine learning techniques to improve some things for which we don't have a theoretical basis or framework. So there's all sorts of entry points for different kinds of models within this space. Right? Okay. So I'm going to go through these sort of two dimensions: climate impacts on food security, agricultural impacts on climate and the earth systems, and then move into the solution space a little bit. And so what I'm trying to do here is a bit of a survey. It's trying to just give you a flavor for some of what I think are the key questions facing modeling of agriculture, or specifically in this case, the modeling of climate change impacts on agriculture. So these are areas of key areas of development that may be of interest to you. So historically, in these climate models, it's only been very recently that we've been able to produce things or looking at crop production, or even resolving the way particular species grow. That's been a relative occurrence. What we've been able to do is represent vegetation and transitions between vegetation, such as forest to cropland more broadly, and compute the climate conditions that either might sustain a certain set of vegetation or crop environment, or look at how changes in climate might change the suitability or certain vegetation conditions. And so what you're looking at here is sort of a simple study not too long ago that articulates this. What you're looking at up top is the change in the future suitability for rain agricultural production, so unirrigated agricultural production, and areas in the green, and you can kind of moving latitudes, right, in the north, are areas that will likely increase in suitability. And this is RCP 8.5. I think you've had some exposure to this shared socioeconomic pathways and climate trajectories. So this is sort of our worst case climate scenario, warmest conditions. And so what you're looking at here are the suitability of croplands, of rain-fed croplands, expanding northward with those temperature increases. Quite simple. And this is sort of a way that models have been used. But what this doesn't consider are sort of the other needs that we have for agriculture: soils, for example, and of course management, and that and the bottom, what you're looking at is the change. So the top is showing you suitability, the bottom is actually showing you the change, with the blue bars largely being increases in suitability. And so models are really important in helping us assess changing suitability for agricultural production and for adaptation. There's some great studies now looking at crop migration, for example. But climate-based suitability assessments won't consider important feedbacks and other components, management, but also climate crop feedbacks. It turns out, and I'll show this in a little bit, that what we plant and how we manage it can actually start to create rather unique or novel climate conditions, right? You've heard of microclimates, for example. So the presence, the actual alteration of what kind of vegetation is on the land surface can feed back to change those climate conditions in that location. Understanding how agriculture, how we create our own environments, right, with agriculture is an important component of this. All right. What you're looking at here is a step more complicated than that. Instead of just looking at suitability, and this is not a climate model. In this case, we're using climate model information in crop models, right? So we're just using what the projected future is of climate, and we're telling a crop model, here's the projected future, tell me what the yield results are going to be, right? And what you're looking, this is a global graded crop modeling initiative, which is called GGCMI, and it's actually a comparison across models. And so on the left-hand side, this is a paper that came out fairly recently. You're looking at, and this is for, again, the SSP 5 8.5. So worst case climate scenario, modeled projections of maize growth, and overwhelmingly quite negative, right, in terms of the yield change across the world. I should mention the hashed areas are areas where there's a lot of uncertainty, and so the model result is not all that significant. And so that's an alarming picture. On the right-hand side is something a little different, maybe a little bit surprising for some of you. That is the modeled wheat projections. And I believe this is mid-century, might be end of century. And what we see are large increases in wheat yield. Now, however, and there is a big however here, right? The way that these models are run, and this is sort of an entry point for development, right? These exclude really important processes, including sensitivity to extremes, which are not going to be well represented here. And one of the reasons that you're seeing some increases, well, I think you've talked about crops and carbon dioxide a little bit, not so much. Okay. So one of the reasons that you see some of those increases, right? In these crop models, the CO2 effects, right? So plants like high CO2 in general, and some plants can become much more efficient at photosynthesis under high CO2, right? Minus all of the other considerations, right? Water, right? Assuming everything else is met. And so part of what you're seeing at higher latitudes, increases are really, really strong effects of carbon dioxide fertilization on crops. However, you can also see a lot of hashing, right? What this should scream to you is we actually have not on how wheat is going to respond to climate change in the future in a modeled environment. This is also not including pests and diseases or anything like that. So if this looks a little bit unbelievable, that, and the next question should be, if we're interested in looking at crop impacts into the future, what do we need to better constrain something like this? Because in some ways, this feels a little bit, too hard to believe, right? But it's kind of important, and this is what I mean. Part of this talk being oriented around modeling is airing a little bit of the dirty laundry that's here, because that's the place where we need new talent, new brain power to think through. Now, here's the thing about those CO2 effects. Okay, and here's why they may not be totally well presented. Much of the detailed management in here, we're including irrigation, we're including applications, sensitivity to CO2. We're including crop species, right? Maize versus wheat. Much of this from industrialized agricultural zones. So this investigate the impact of higher overwhelmingly concentrated in high industrial agricultural zones. We have very little information across many areas, particularly areas that were in the green in that feeding people map, right? Where crops directly feed people, right? We're devoid of information in these locations. And so we know that responses in the appropriate ways in these contexts. We don't, right? To some extent. And so that's an important gap, data gap, that needs to be filled. Now, CO2 effects in the way that we conduct future when we model simulations into the future to project yield, we need to include the CO2 effects. But if they're not well constrained in some locations, we need to make sure that we consider that, right, when we interpret the response. Yeah.
So in areas that are not in industrial agricultural zones, how do they get the data for the prior map, like the orange one? So many, I mean, is that model like potential of where maize could grow? Because a lot of those areas are not currently growing much maize at all.
And some they are, but in others not. So you're looking at, yeah, so this is a very good question. There have been some issues in crop masking, like masking what areas grow what. And so definitely this is sort of just looking at where these crops could grow more than where they are grown at any given time, right? And there's probably some rotation, right, or some cropping, some diversified cropping in a lot of those locations where you're not seeing the CO2 effects. And so we do have, global maps of cropped area that, again, don't capture interannual variability, but they do capture, broadly speaking, where these crops could be growing or have been documented to grow, right, based upon survey data or something like that. And so it's those underlying maps with all those assumptions that are going into producing something like this. in the original wheat, if you look at the first paper, the first version of this work that was done several years before, you'll actually see a bunch of like wheat growing in the Amazon, which doesn't make any sense at all. So they've actually, this is actually an improvement, is what I want to say on those crop maps. But they're basically collected using whatever crop mapping information we have available from a variety of sources, FAO being one of them. But it's not meant to necessarily, this is not meant to be a temporally explicit, here's what these farmers are growing now. Yeah, it's just sort of a map of where they could be grown, if you want to interpret that way. So yeah, so there's some big limitations here. Yeah. All right. Oh, and the one thing to say about these CO2 effects, I should also mention data is lacking, not just geospatially and temporally, but so much work focuses on maize, rice, wheat, and soy, that important food crops. So pulses, coarse grains, cassava, right? These are pretty much underrepresented across all these crop data sets. And then the third thing I'll quickly say about these CO2 effects, there has been some really interesting work. Louis Ziska, for example, they've been trying to document the impact of high CO2, not just on yield. We're so yield focused, but there's so much else about ag that matters, right? Like micronutrients. And one thing that seems to be a common finding now across studies of rice is a decline in the nutrient content that happens with high CO2. So maybe you'd be boosting the yields depending upon if you have all of your other conditions met, but it might be coming at a nutrient deficiency as well too. And so that's new and emerging work that's very interesting that requires more exploration. Okay, and I mentioned it at the beginning. You know, with Pakistan on my mind. Before that, across the Indo-Gangetic Basin, there was a massive heat wave, extremes, right? And in some ways, you know, long-term climate change, okay, fine, we can sort of look at these scenarios and think about what happens on average at long timescales. We could talk about 1.5 or 2 degrees C, and ultimately this means nothing, right? Like this feels very removed, not that it is nothing, it feels like nothing, right? It feels very removed from our concerns and considerations and the planning that we need to do today. And these things are important, but I think what we think about when you say climate change and what comes to mind are our extremes in the experience of how prepared we are, right? How much we can adapt. What are the limits of adaptability under extremes? And this matters. Been a lot of work, and in these models, there is some sensitivity to dry extremes, droughts or heat. To some extent, it's not perfect, but it's there, and it's probably not as severe as it should be, these sensitivity. But one of the things that we're realizing is that humid and wet extremes, what you're looking at here is an empirical analysis that looked at the yield impacts as a result of very wet conditions in the Midwest versus dry, that these are of to the, and yet our ability to represent wet super for crops is actually much less developed in these models than the droughts and so that we really need to get better at doing. And then one thing to recognize is we tend to look at these extremes. It's hot, it's wet. But in reality, what's happening, and probably happening a bit more frequently, are what we call compound extremes, right? So we kind of are slammed with both hot and dry conditions, right? Maybe you have a flood, and after that you have a drought, or vice versa. I think California right now, right? And so that we even have more, even poorer constraints on in terms of how crops respond, right? And how agricultural systems respond. And it gets complicated. It's not just high heat, and that's what does the damage. There's a set of interactions, which I won't go through here, but there's and I have all the references later on, so yeah, this will be circulated. There's a whole host of interactions that need to be considered together right, in order to understand what the crop response is. And so here's an entry point, I think, for more empirical modeling, because I think it'll be a little while before we can really represent this well in a process-based modeling framework. But for those of you working on statistical modeling, right, empirical formulations, here's a nice entry point to kind of examine the influence of compound extremes. Okay. Any question? Those are just, this is not exhaustive. There's issues, Peter and a few others, colleagues are working on air pollution, for example. That's another huge wild card in all of this. Pest and disease migration mobility is another huge wild card in all of this. And I would say at least the pest and diseases are really not included at all in most of these modeling frameworks. And that's something we're just not accounting for. So this is not an exhaustive list, but these are just entry points that can be tackled now. Any questions? Yeah.
I'm thinking more general.
Mm-hmm.
We talked a lot about some like scientific models,
Mm-hmm.
as you alluded to earlier, like social science, important
Yeah.
change.
Yeah.
How do our models inform, like how we talk to people about climate change, or how do we inform policy about climate change?
So that is a great question. And so the question is, right, we've talked about the biophysical side of things. And so there's this whole social component. And so how do models inform sort of the social, the policy, that kind of thing? I'm going to flip that. And I'm going to ask right now, how can what we know about social science and policy and governance inform the way that we represent this stuff in the models? And so on the one hand, right, you've learned about the shared socioeconomic pathways, for example, and different scenarios of climate change. That is one step, one way that models can help stakeholders and policymakers and decision makers to bracket potential changes, right, in future climate. And we can translate those scenarios to crop impacts and water impacts and all sorts of things, right? But I think what we're finding is that those scenarios and the impacts projected by those scenarios are not complete and lacking really important processes. A lot of how crops respond to extremes or crops respond to changing climate suitability, that's a function of management, right? Or technological development. And so I would argue, I work a lot looking at irrigation, for example. I would argue that I actually, as a modeler, need to know more from the policy social science component about how farmers manage their land in order to incorporate that into models to better represent these processes and then give that information back. So there needs to be a much bigger dialogue back and forth here to co-develop. I hate buzzword terms, but I do think that's useful. I won't use synergies. I'm never going to use synergies, but co-develop, right? Co-develop is good. So yeah, so I do think that it's not a matter of how can the climate community make stuff that's more useful to the social science community. I think there's a need to blend these groups together to produce the information we need. Is that, okay, yeah, I wasn't trying to divert your question, but you know, I'm as confused as you are. Yeah, right. Okay, so moving on here, and again, not exhaustive, but just trying to plant a seed, if you will. Okay, so agricultural impacts on the earth system. So I'll just let me ask this here. Has anyone seen this? The underlying green, red, yellow diagram. Couple of you. Okay, again, not as many as I would have thought. I guess this is just falling out of favor, which is maybe good or bad. I don't know. So what you're looking at here is it's what's often termed the planetary boundaries, okay? There's actually like an entire Netflix series on planetary boundaries. I don't know if anyone has actually seen this, but I haven't seen it. But anyway, you can look it up. But so what this is attempting to show, and you'll notice climate change is just one component here, are different components of global environmental change, okay? And these concentric circles are stand-in for some kind of quantitative bounding, right? So there's some kind of limit. The green, okay, is the limit within which we have a safe operating space for humanity. So we're living within the bounds that doesn't disrupt natural processes. The yellow is a bound of uncertainty where we've transgressed what we know to be a safe operating space, but we're not quite sure what the impacts are. Okay, there's limitations to maybe our understanding, but we know we're kind of pushing the envelope of what we've been able, of what we've seen historically. The red areas are areas of exceedance where we know that we're imposing dangerous interference. Okay, and we need to get back into the yellow, ideally the green, as fast as possible, right? So that's sort of we've transgressed that boundary. And so you could argue for climate change, we're getting there, if not there already. This is a little bit of an older diagram. What I like about this, so that's the figure. If you start to Google it, or if you know anything about it, it's like there's just a ton of controversy. People either love or hate this figure. The only reason I'm employing it here because it moves us beyond just talking about climate change all the time. It's important, but there tends to be a certain kind of reductionism that's associated with that. Instead, we need to be talking about more than just greenhouse gas driven climate change, right? We have a biodiversity crisis, right? We have a biogeochemical crisis, right? In terms of exceeding those flows. We're fast progressing on ocean acidification. What I like also about this figure, other than opening our minds to more than just climate change, okay, is the superposition of these black dots. That is the estimated role of agriculture, okay? So agriculture right now, just considering land use land cover change and the greenhouse gas associated with intensification is about a quarter of the climate change impact. And if you include the aerosol component, it can be even more than that. But in some of these other, and which is high, that's already high, okay, from a climate change perspective. For these other components, agriculture is arguably the leading driver of exceeding these planetary boundaries. Okay, so it's not just about climate change. When I show you a solution space, remember, this is not just about greenhouse gas emissions or carbon sequestration. We have to move beyond that because there are trade-offs associated with dealing with each of these in turn or together. So this approach, thinking about this in terms of all of the elements of global environmental change, allows us to consider the risks posed by agriculture across the Earth system, not just the climate system. Now, modeling capacity, our ability to represent this stuff in models is increasing. It's not perfect. Some of it is in its infancy, but it's there. So now is a good time to get into the space to start pushing and trying to represent this better. Right? And I should mention that while I've highlighted in the blue the key components that I'll just quickly go through, the yellow orange components articulate connectivities to other Earth system components. Think about nutrient runoff and dead zones, right? In the Gulf, for example. So this extends beyond the terrestrial environment. Okay. So much of what's been done in the climate modeling space has been on land change, but really land cover change. So from forest to cropland. And that's gotten us quite far in thinking about some of the impacts from agriculture, but it's definitely not the, we're realizing that that's, right, if you're just looking from a climate change perspective, that's one thing. But when you start to need to resolve the biogeochemical flows, this doesn't get us all the way there. So this is a fairly well-developed part of looking at the impacts of land cover or agriculture on climate, but not quite there. And no, what I also like about this figure is that it shows us how much of Earth's landscape we're actually managing, right? We talk about natural areas, whatever that means, right? And that can be fraught for all sorts of reasons. But we are arguably managing so much of the world's surface, either directly or indirectly, terrestrial surface at this point, that if we don't have management represented in these models, we are missing the bigger picture. Okay, so this is something that needs to be said and we need to reckon with. This will have implications with biodiversity, which we talk about a bit later. Water, I just spoke about water a bit earlier, but agriculture accounts, I don't have it here, agricultural irrigation accounts for about 70% of our global freshwater use, 70%. When you start to move into South Asia, where I do a lot of other regional work, that figure gets closer to about 90 going to agriculture. So it's an inordinate user of fresh water. And in some areas, which is what you're looking at here, that are reliant on groundwater. Those areas of orange and red, and to some extent the yellow, are areas that are either super stressed or entering into stress, right? Those aquifers are being overdrawn, right? And the recharge is not happening quickly enough. And this will be exacerbated. This is going to be exacerbated as a result of climate change. Yes.
Hi.
Hi.
So I'm it's kind of coming to me now.
Yeah.
The importance that we don't have granular information about small agricultural operations. So when I'm looking at these maps and these models, should I always assume that these are based on industrial practices? And the reason I'm asking that is because if we were to have that granular information about, I don't know, this village in Haiti has this plot of land dedicated to agriculture, which is all over the world, would all of this be sort of amplified? Is it fair to say that we're almost underestimating?
Yeah, this is a really great question. And the answer is not, so what is the role of smallholder production versus the big industrial production, right? And this is like such a great question. And so much we're grappling with so much of this. So much of what you're seeing with the overdrawn aquifers, for example, on this particular picture, and the large amounts of resource use, and I'll show you that in 1 second. So here you see it again a little bit. Areas in the green are using excessive, but large amounts of nitrogen compared to areas in the orange, which are not getting that fertilizer, right? A lot of that and what we're seeing here is driven by sort of export commercial agriculture, usually larger systems. Not that there's not smaller holders, like, you know, what constitutes a large landholder in the Indo-Gangetic Basin is going to be very different than what constitutes a large landholder in the US Midwest, for example. But relative to those domains, right, there are large and small farmers. So even, and this is so interesting, even what constitutes a smallholder farmer is totally in contention across the literature when you start to define that. So in terms of overall resource use, yes, all of this is sort of just pegged to what we know about the industrial production, the commercial production side of things. However, that does not mean that the smallholder footprint, if you will, isn't also in aggregate, right, globally large. It's just, it becomes harder. I mean, I'll just be, it becomes harder and a lot more contentious for good reasons to assign responsibility, right? Like, are you really going to tell those farmers they can't use X, Y, and Z? Like, there's that element, there's an equity element here. And then on top of that, we are very data limited on what the individual contributions from these smallholder farmers are, to the extent they're smallholder. Right. So I'm kind of dodging your question a little bit, only because it is that question kind of rips open an entire field of study and kind of literature. But a lot of the impact that you're seeing here is sort of ascribed to the larger scale production to an extent. The one thing I'll complicate that again with is that larger scale commercial production for the crop systems they have. So maize, rice, wheat, soy, whatever. One could argue, depending upon how you define efficiency, right, that those are more efficient with respect to single factor use, so your input of fertilizer, input of irrigation, and because the production is so high, right? But if you then instead define efficiency as the total production of a diversified cropping system, that's a different definition. And then suddenly your playing field starts to look a little bit different. It gets back to those two plots that I showed at the very beginning, the yield gap versus the calories to people. That calories to people is really reflecting smallholder agriculture. And so if you normalize based upon number of people fed versus yield, you get a very different picture.
Right, because
Yeah.
the industrial operations are not just feeding people.
Right.
Okay.
They're serving a whole, and often they're not directly, except for wheat and, you know, and those, even those are export oriented in large ways, or you know, in South Asia there's a lot of national stock building, for example, right? For soy and maize, those aren't really, those are going to other end uses. Now they're economically relevant, but these are the trade-offs then we have to make. Yeah. So it's a good question, but it's a huge question. Yeah. Does that help?
Yes.
Okay. Any other? Okay, awesome. I'm actually winding up now and I can get right into the solution space. So, right. So I showed the nitrogen, the soil degradation is also something we actually don't have very good constraints on. Soil maps of soil carbon can differ by a significant amount, but there is rising emphasis on building carbon within agroecosystems in order to mitigate climate change. There are emerging carbon markets. I was just talking with somebody this morning about carbon markets emerging in India to pay farmers to sequester carbon, right? Sounds like a great idea, and I have no problem with building carbon to the extent that that's climate relevant, that it can actually serve mitigation is a whole other can of worms that that we need to open up. You know, in talking about all this, you realize how many like puns you can come up with that are just like, you know, anyway, but no pun intended. But soil carbon and soil erosion, the loss of topsoil, also key components of the Earth system that we can now start to resolve a bit better in these models. And we really need to do more of it if we're going to start talking about carbon for mitigation. Okay, it is 4:35, and I want to talk just a little bit about the solution space here. And so I've basically said everything that's on here, and you have the slides. But okay, so some comments on the solution space. And again, part of this is a little provocative, but I think these are the conversations we just need to open and start having. So the first thing I'll quickly say is that I've been for probably too long, a project called the Agricultural Model Intercomparison Project, or AGMIT. And what we're trying to do, so this moves away from Earth global scale modeling and kind of zooms into the local scale. What we're trying to do is project and predict the impacts of climate change on food security by through an integrated assessment, which means we link climate models and future scenarios with models, and then we take one step further to actually include agricultural economic models. So we're using a trade-off analysis. This requires that we are actually pinning our models, both the crop and our economic model, to household data. So we're resolving farm management. For example, we just finished up a project in Bangladesh with about 3,000 farmers, and we're resolving all of these households. Is to understand for each one of these farmers, what is the impact of climate change, not just on production, but on their food security, livelihoods, farm returns, and what would be the benefit of a potential adaptation option. So that's something else we can test in the modeling space that can be hard for 3,000 farms across a large area, right? So that's what models allow us to do, right? Once we calibrate and validate them. Now, in terms of the solution space, we've models now that resolve greenhouse gas fluxes and soil carbon sequestration. So we can now look at production next to greenhouse gas emissions from these systems. And I'm going to only talk about this plot. This is giving you a sense of one of the things we're finding that's in prep right now. I'm not going to talk about this, but what you're looking on the left right now is a set of farms, several hundred farmers in Vietnam. And we were working in the Red River Delta on rice-based farming systems. And so the box plots that you're looking at here are across all the different farm sites. This is under baseline management, so what farmers are currently doing. What we were interested to test is a rice intervention that conserves water, and because you're not flooding the rice paddy, it mitigates methane emissions. And so we wanted to know, we tested 3 different flavors of this intervention. We wanted to know, how does this intervention do at getting at both and mitigation? So boosting yields while also mitigating emissions. And what this is a climate smart index score. And so the closer those box plots, all these points are to 1, it means that you're boosting yields while reducing methane, while reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Closer this gets to -1, it means greenhouse gas emissions are going up, which is not what you want, at the expense of yield. All right, so you want to get close to 1. And so one of the things that we found is that at least 2 of our interventions did pretty well, right? Those box plots get closer to 1, the median moves up, the range narrows. So all of these farmers benefit from this intervention, all right? Now, that's under current climate conditions. Once we hit these systems with future climate, in this case in SSP2 4.5, so pretty mid-range climate scenario, this is what happens. These points, these are median values across the farm. And so what you're seeing here are reductions overall. Climate change reduces how climate smart, how well these interventions work. Now, relative to each other, intervention 2 still does better in some cases across these management interventions. But you now start to have, depending upon what climate model you use, these are 5 different climate models, so 5 different versions of this scenario, okay? This is why multi-model is so important. Depending upon what model you use, you may not have as much of a gain, right? So here's where the climate uncertainty starts to matter, right? What future scenario, what future version you choose can have an impact, right, on the intersection of adaptation and mitigation. And here what you're looking at is something similar, but the net farm return. So I don't have time to look at that for right now, but I can come back to that in a minute. But this is the kind of thing, right? This intersection between getting to 1, right? Boosting yields and reducing greenhouse gases is kind of what we're after in this climate smart space, right? How close can we get to that? And who benefits and who doesn't? Okay, so I'm kind of at time. So I just want to, I'm mostly at that. I just want to skip a couple slides because I want to flag a few things. So there has been a recent effort, and it's been updated since now, very controversial. Some people hate this. I think it's useful. Where this is the Eat Lancet Commission. And what they had done, their first round of work, I liked a little bit better, is kind of take the planetary boundaries that you saw earlier and ask the question, what would you need to do in food systems to meet this? What would it take to get into the green or yellow or get out of the red, okay, across these spaces? And they did a ton of modeling on this, different kinds of models they brought together. Nothing is perfect, but ultimately what they found was that you need to improve production, smarter production. You need to cut waste by half. That's a whole other thing that we haven't talked about. And folks, I hate to say it, dietary shifts have to be on the menu. We have to talk about that. We may not like it. We may decide, oh, well, maybe that's for somebody else. And that's okay, but that conversation needs to be had in order to move into a world that kind of meets all of these goals, right? That conversation is important to not shy away from. So on these dimensions, there's improved production. So there's been mapping of conservation agriculture and the impact that conservation agriculture has, so improved management techniques. There's also been some mapping and trying to incorporate the role of organics, particularly for models that have nutrient cycling, right? How do you start looking at organic amendments and production methods? So that's something we're increasingly being able to consider and how we represent in our models. And this is just showing you the benefits of organic versus conventional. I'm just trying to talk about this a little bit. In terms of diet, well, how do you model a dietary shift? Well, that can get really complicated. From an Earth systems perspective, I think there are still kind of interesting ways to do it that move beyond the SSPs. And that is that there have been an increasing number of studies to evaluate the land savings of switching diets, right? And there's different ways to do this. Maybe you don't go all vegan, maybe you only do partially, or maybe you do like a flexitarian. There's all sorts of combinations of things you can do, and then estimate the land use required in order to meet those dietary goals. And once you know and you're able to map that landscape, then you can start to look at things like vegetation conversion and carbon retention, right, across these landscapes. And so here's one such study. There's big uncertainty bars across all of this, but it's compelling to say, okay, if you moved food and diets into a more plant-based space, right? Compared to business as usual, right? How much, and you distributed that crop growth and calories needed across the world. You can experiment with a variety of ways of how that crop distribution looks, but you're basically growing alternative crops in places where they're most suitable, okay? How much land could you potentially save? And so what you're looking at here is the carbon cost with anything above the zero of a business as usual dietary scenario up to 2050. Here is an Eat Lancet. So the diet I showed you earlier, that Eat Lancet Commission, right? So what we looked at here, what's controversial about this is they actually prescribed a diet, and nutritionists like hated this, but it was interesting, not perfect, but interesting. And so if you follow this diet, which is not vegan, not vegetarian, but if you follow it, you actually wind up still, because it's moving towards plant-based with a bit more carbon savings. And then of course, if you did a vegan diet, that would get you more, right? So again, this is all hand wavy, no offense, that's my colleague to some extent. But what's compelling about it is that if we know this, we can start to think about this from an Earth system modeling perspective, right? This is also true of biodiversity loss. And so again, and this is all these references are there. I just wanted to flag that all of this exists. This is a study that maps crops versus biodiversity, okay? If we had landscapes where we put all of the crops in some land and made that very intensive, and then left the rest of the land free from human use, natural, so land sparing, right? Where do we get production shortfalls and calories, okay? Like where do we actually start to produce more or less food? And then this scenario is like, well, what if we integrated it? What if we actually had farms that were more biodiverse, that fostered biodiversity? Where would the impact on food production be? And in either scenario, one of the things that you see is that there can be calorie losses associated with that if you assume current diets, okay? If you assume current dietary trends. So now we're dealing not with just trade-offs in carbon, but trade-offs in biodiversity. Okay, and then finally, mitigation, adaptation, there are so many components of carbon dioxide removal or climate mitigation that revolve around managed lands. Some of these are relatively low cost, like cover cropping, potentially, or grazing legumes. Some of them move in towards more effective, but potentially at higher costs, or they become cost effective depending upon what you've pegged your social cost of carbon or something to. The point that I want to make here is that a lot of this stuff focuses on carbon, soil carbon in particular. In order to get these carbon crediting schemes, maybe none of you care about this, but some of you only care about the financing side of things. Fine. Most of what we talk about in terms of carbon crediting schemes for farmers or whatever focus on carbon and soil carbon in agroecosystems. Very few of these schemes consider methane, nitrous oxide, or greenhouse gas emissions overall back to the atmosphere. So we need to move beyond just thinking about carbon and soil carbon within these kinds of schemes. So full cost accounting is what I'm advocating for. All of this is great. I'm not gonna, it's fine, but we need to be reasonable about how we're assessing this. Okay, so on that note, right, there are just some summary points to kind of take away. And one thing I said earlier that I want to come back to is just this bullet point, and that is that, having given you an entire talk about models, I do want to very like I want to try to convince you I'm not a model evangelist. In fact, I actually see that we need way more done on the data collection and observation side of things than the models at this point, because the models lack all of these things. But the climate scenario have to take, this is going to increase model complexity and uncertainty. And so I think for the next generation of modelers, whatever tools you use coming into this space, being very cognizant of the trade-offs that happen when you build models, particularly when you want to represent complex processes, and asking the question, what question am I trying to answer? What are the trade-offs involved? And how much information do I need to set of things to go through before you start tackling some of these questions. So on that note, I've been talking a lot today. Yeah, I will leave you with this, and I am happy to answer any questions, and thank you for hearing me rant for a little bit. Yeah, and I think maybe.
Questions?
Sometimes like when data from farmers, they get like anxious for open sourcing and like
Yeah.
up information.
Yeah.
to, like rival farmers.
Right.
So how do you think that like people who are collecting the data for these models can go about convincing these farmers that it's worth sharing their data?
Yeah, this is a great question. So the question was privacy considerations and how difficult it can be to get data from farmers. I don't think I can speak to what's needed to convince a farmer to hand over data. And there's an assortment of considerations, some more frustrating, some very valid about that. So there has been a whole push as part of the last iteration of the Farm Bill to have an anonymized database of management information, actually to facilitate soil carbon sequestration and that sort of analysis. Knowing that for a lot of this, we really need fine spatial scale data and temporal data. And so the idea was to create a USDA hosted database of anonymized farmer management information. And that didn't quite go anywhere. I think it might be up and running. I think what this is going to hinge on is that, and maybe this is a useful way to invoke carbon markets in order to understand and farmers to kind of derive some benefit from this to the extent that we want to do that, which is another question. But if we do want to do that, it's going to be really impossible to do rigorously and well without that kind of data. And so in some ways, it's in the farmer's interest to participate in some kind of, and I think the anonymization and the way that that data is protected and looked at needs to be very, it needs to be demonstrable, right? Like I think that, and in some ways, like, you know, and I don't know the specifics of this as much, but I've heard a lot about like, I don't know, like John Deere and these precision techniques, like that information is very proprietary, you know, that. So in some ways, farmers are trading off information anyway, right? And so to the extent that this is now more useful, I think there can be comparisons made to something like that. The other component of this that could get at the anonymization problem, and this is by no means a panacea because we're far from being able to get a lot of this information, but there has been the rise of remote sensing and other kinds of sensing techniques that can give us a bit more fine-grained information now without necessarily having to, like, you know, ping a farmer. But there is some, like, do the farmer surveys match what you're seeing from space? And that's kind of an interesting kind of tension there. So I don't have a good answer for you. I wonder how much we can leverage the need for mitigation to help farmers feel a little bit more confident in sharing that. But that is going to be an eternal hurdle that I think we're going to just try to have to face. Yeah, sorry.
Other questions?
I was wondering, can the population be included in the models?
Yeah.
If the population can be part of the Earth system.
Yeah, that's a great question. And so in some ways, I think when you start, okay, so when you start looking at these future scenarios and pathways, right, some of that assume, I think, some population trajectories and things along that front, and at least the requirements, dietary requirements, for example, that go along with business as usual trajectories. So in some ways, for some scenarios, that's sort of implicitly built in. I think, yes, it should be incorporated more as, you know, so with irrigation, for example, there were some good papers that came out that were compelling, that were compelling, that suggested that population density versus just population alone is that's a really important correlate with irrigated area. And so if you can model and get better estimates of population density, you can better map irrigated area. And then the irrigated area maps are what kind of feed into the space much more readily. So I think there's implicit ways to look at that, the influence of population on land cover change, for example. And I think people are doing that in some of these estimates. For example, that dietary modeling, I think that actually had the estimation of a population bound within there by 2050. So it's in there implicitly, but I do agree finding connections between population and even more than population, income, wealth, right? Wealth and all of these metrics is another entry point for modeling. Yeah.
Time for one more question, please. Yeah.
I'm sure you're aware of this, but the use of renewables and like solar panels kind of taking over agricultural,
Yeah.
especially like kind of in this area of the country. I wonder if there's been any concern on that kind of affecting food production.
Yeah.
Really, because this area of the country doesn't have a lot of food insecurity.
Yeah, this is a great question. I couldn't tell you or name any direct studies that are kind of looking at that trade-off here, but it is something that I was actually just having a conversation about this with somebody, citing for renewables and the entry point with, and this is all part of like, we talk about like climate mitigation, carbon dioxide removal. To me, it's more expansive than that. It's like forestation, afforestation, avoided deforestation, agricultural soil sequestration, and siting for renewables. I actually think should be part of that. In some cases, you could even expand the role of land in climate mitigation. You can even expand that to mining of minerals that serve the energy transition, right? So, so yes, I think at a local scale, this is being examined from a governance perspective. I've seen policy papers and local governance, community governance papers around intersections where you can minimize trade-offs and have co-benefits with citing renewables, for example, solar versus other. I actually had, this is really controversial, and somebody can fact check this, but actually I heard a talk by Charlie Canham from the Carey Institute. And I think he said something like, it was either 1,000 trees or 1,000 acres of trees. And I think it might be the latter. He did a calculation of carbon avoided emissions as a result of the carbon sequestration from northeastern forests versus an acre of solar panels. And an acre of solar panels was more efficient. Like, and you know, that's coming from a tree guy, right? So these trade-offs are really important. I agree with you. And so I imagine you'll see more in the space developing on that, but I haven't seen anything of like, it might exist, but I haven't seen that myself in the air system modeling. Yeah. Right. Thank you.